okay? So I want to just introduce Father Charles Sikorsky now, who's our first speaker of the morning. Charles is hails from Baltimore, as myself. We entered the Legionaries together in the early 90s and consider him not just a brother in Christ, but really a Baltimore brother. So a little bit about Father Charles. He's the current president of Divine Mercy University, but also the Institute of Psychological Sciences, which really was what originally founded, you could say the original seed of Divine Mercy was through that institute. And he has devoted himself to growing the university in the academia, the church, and our country, without question, also into the rest of the world. He's a canon and civil lawyer, trained in philosophy and theology from Baltimore, Maryland, University of Baltimore, Maryland. Father Charles earned a law degree from the University of Maryland, obtaining a BA in political economy from Johns Hopkins University. Upon entering the seminary, he earned degrees in philosophy and theology from the Regina Apostolorum Pontifical University in Rome, and he also has a licentiate in canon law from the Gregorian University in Rome. So he will join us now this morning, round of applause, and speak on what is culture.
Okay, thank you, Father Martin. So yeah, we both grew up in Baltimore, and now I'm in Northern Virginia, and unfortunately the weather's exactly the same. But there are more guns in Virginia than Maryland, I think. So anyway, Father was talking about where we are in the building, and it made me think back to when 31 years ago is when I started my vocation. We were actually in this very room. It didn't look like this. There was no stage. There was no seats. The slope wasn't there yet. I don't think there was air conditioning. That was my Father Edward Hopkins remembers. But this was our dorm, and we had like 50 to 60 beds just all over the place. And you got a dorm or a zoo. I'm not sure what it was. Right? There were no dividers or anything like that. But one story maybe that you could apply to vocational culture. One night there was, I guess this was a tradition, that they went and took one guy when he was asleep, took his bed out and carried him all the way into the front of the reception area and left him there, right in front of the statue of Mary when you come in. And they justified it, well, we couldn't get him through the one door right by we had to take it through the chapel. So we did genuflect when we got to the front of it, right? So you can learn a lot about our culture. Maybe you want to leave right now, some of you. But I think it's really important this day that we talk. I don't have a lot of direct vocational experience, but I don't know if you've seen this movie, Nefarious, that came out recently. And if you haven't, just a quick description, but there's a scene in there that really strikes me about why we're here. So Nefarious is about a guy who is on death row, and it's the day of his execution. And he's, before they get executed, they need a psychiatrist to come in and say that he's mentally capable to be executed, right? That's the way the law works. So, of course, it's an atheist psychiatrist, and the guy is possessed by a demon called Nefarious. Right? He takes over his will and speaks through him and acts, says all kinds of things. And anyway, there's a scene where a priest comes in, and the demon or Nefarious sees the collar and starts freaking out. Oh my God, get him out of here. No, don't go away. Because the psychiatrist wasn't getting anywhere with this guy, but now he's like, oh, get away. Well, then the priest walks over, and he's kind of got like sort of looks like a rainbow stole on, and he goes and starts, hey, we really don't believe in the devil anymore. It's not that big of a deal. Like, oh, welcome. Very nice to have you here. And it just struck me as how important the priesthood is, the power of an ordained priest, the power of the sacrament of orders. The devil knows that power. The devil sees that power. And I think it's something for us to make me reflect more and more on my own identity. And I think as we go through these conferences and these days here, thinking about of vocation culture, thinking about what we can do to help support all kinds of, not just priestly vocations, obviously, consecrated, religious, etc. But, and I think a lot of my reflections might be more priestly, or they will be, but I think they can be applied to all vocations. We can maybe substitute the words there. But just how beautiful, how important, just how necessary vocations are, and how impactful they can be. Just the witness of priestly life, the witness of consecrated life, what it does, right? The enemies of God see that, they understand that. So what I'd like to do in this talk, basically three goals here. First, what is the core or the essence of what a culture is, a culture in general, right? We want to kind of go through some definitions, some examples to kind of get an idea. The core is kind of like charism. It's kind of hard to technically, specifically define. There's a lot of different factors that go into it, more a way of life. But what is the essence of culture, of a culture? Second goal, just to get us all thinking about how do we apply that to vocations, right? What's the essence of a culture? What does a vocation culture look like? Or could it look like? It's really, I don't have many answers, but the idea is to get us all thinking about that, and what that could be or should be. And then finally, what are the challenges that are out there to building and having a vocation culture? So what's the essence of it? How can that be applied to vocations? The clicker's there, okay. And some challenge, yeah, we'll get there, okay. Thank you. So those are the three goals, and more just to stimulate thought, to provoke conversations. I don't have the answers, all the answers. I pray a lot. I try to discern. But I don't speak for the Holy Spirit, okay? Some people try to say that sometimes, but I don't speak for the Holy Spirit. And any bad ideas, I don't blame on the Holy Spirit. They're all mine. Things you might not agree with, it's all my fault, okay? So don't blame it on God. And so let's start. So some basic definitions of culture. Great. Does anybody know how to work a clicker? Oh, you're good, okay. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so these are just basic common definitions that we talk about culture as all the ways of life, including arts, beliefs, institutions of population passed down from generation to generation. In the last sentence there, the way of life for an entire society. It's kind of one of the common ways. If you look at, different definition has, values, beliefs, norms, symbols, language, rituals. And then, a lot of companies and organizations talk about it, and it's kind of similar, right? It's generally understood as all those companies' beliefs, values, attitudes, and how these influence the behavior of the employees. So these are sort of your basic dictionary definitions, basic definitions from organizations and so forth. But this whole idea of values, beliefs, of way of life. If you go to the next slide, St. John Paul II, I wanted to bring him into this because I think we can learn an awful lot about culture from him. He was really, as you know, he was a actor, he was a poet, and his experience in the communist world in Poland, culture was what they relied back on, what they relied on, right? The government was too powerful. The government, they couldn't change really quickly the politics. It was, the Soviet Union and so forth, but he saw the value of culture, one thing that could not be taken away, no matter what the external factors are. And so as a poet, as a actor, he saw the success of that in Poland, and then he actually started, back in the early 80s, he started the Pontifical Council for Culture. So one of the fundamental things, and he was very instrumental as well at Vatican II in talking about the role of culture and the role of culture in evangelization. We're going to go through his basic definition, the specific way of human existence, and that which determines the interhuman and social character of human existence, okay, or a shared way of life, and all those aspects of it. It's not just isolating into one or two things. And I'm going to go through, there are 4 things that over the years in his pontificate he kind of talked about, and how this works in evangelization, and what we can learn the role of culture in evangelization. What can we learn of how we would build a culture, or think about a culture? So if you go to the next slide, he had 4 reflections. And go to the next one, we'll get to the first one. Faith is incomplete if not lived out in a culture. A culture opposed to faith creates obstacles in living out that faith. So this is one of the things that John Paul spoke about quite a bit, that faith, it's incomplete if it's not lived out in a culture. So you think about the incarnation, right? A very Catholic way of looking at things. It's not enough just to believe. You have to live that out, because what makes the culture important is because Jesus became man. God became man. God became a part of everything. You know, and therefore, our faith needs to be lived out in a culture. And if the culture is opposed to faith, it creates obstacles in living out that faith. So if you substitute sort of vocation work, right? A culture that opposes vocations or opposes whatever is necessary, doesn't create that atmosphere and puts obstacles in the way, where it becomes a problem, right? So faith is a reciprocal relationship. Faith needs culture, and culture needs faith. Faith needs culture, culture needs faith. George Weigel was talking about John Paul, and he said, in his way of thinking, history is not simply the byproduct of the context for power in the world. Rather, history is driven over the long haul by culture, by what men and women honor, cherish, and worship, by what societies deem to be true and good and noble. So as I say, this idea of the long haul, the need for a culture to sustain faith, to sustain and help faith germinate and spread, right? It needs to be lived out in a culture, and it needs to be complementary, not have a culture with obstacles. The second reflection from John Paul: culture provides a medium for dialogue between believers and unbelievers. Okay, so the role of culture is a way to meet people where they are, so to speak, right? A medium for dialogue and conversation. That was, you know, he had so many different initiatives in that way. All of his trips, 160 trips, he went around the world. He met people where they were. You know, funny, you know, everybody thinks John Paul was their pope. He really understood their country, right? The Mexicans say, oh, John Paul was the Mexican pope. And obviously the Poles loved him so much. And even in the United States, I remember reading when he came to the United States, some of his statements, his sermons, and talking about the freedom of the United States and the Constitution. He hit it right on the nail, right the nail on the head, right? He said, one of the things he said was, freedom isn't the capacity to do what we want, but to do what we should. It's such a subtle distinction, but so, well, he really gets the Americans. So I was at this event one time, and it kind of surprised me. The Japanese were saying, no, John Paul was their pope. John Paul got Japan, right? So in a way, without embracing the things that are anti-Christian or anti-gospel in cultures, he was able to form that bond. And one of his quotes here, I'll pull up, he talks about how that we have a duty, it's incumbent upon all to listen carefully to modern man, not in order to approve all of his behavior, but rather in order to discover the first of all his latent hopes and aspirations. And you can think about that in our own culture in so many different ways, right? It's not that we embrace or bad behavior, anti-gospel behavior. What's behind that? What are people really longing for? It's really important for us to understand that. That's part of culture, of creating those mediums between believers and unbelievers. And maybe vocation work where we're working with believers, but maybe there come up times, where, I really want to go to college. I really want to do this, that, or the other thing. And maybe they don't really appreciate the whole bigger context, right? And how do we work with people like that? And a culture can help build that, maybe. Okay, the third reflection, St. John Paul II. The goal is to build a civilization of love that enables the human person to live freely in the truth. And love, freedom, and truth are the words that jumped out at me when I read this, right? That what are we using the culture for? A culture that's to serve the human person, and that's what he was talking about in this context. The culture is to serve the human person. How do you serve the ways to do that? It's something that creates love, that allows people to live freely and in the truth. And they may seem like contradictions to a lot of people today. Sometimes to us it might seem like contradiction. But you think about vocations, it helps us become any vocation, whatever our vocation is, right? There's that fulfillment, that sense of fulfillment. I was made for this. I was put here for whatever it is. I was put here to be married. I was put here to be a religious. I was put here to be a priest, consecrated, whatever it might be. And the highest form of love is someone who helped me get there, right? And you're really, the whole way we look at people and look at this work, right? It's a culture of love. It's a culture of love to help us, to help others live freely in the truth. And that freedom that comes with being, like knowing who you are, being comfortable in your own skin, and you don't have to just be who you are. What a great blessing. And that really comes from understanding why God made us, why God put us here. And the more we get into that, the more we discover that in our own lives, how beautiful that is. And really, so that's what the goal of the culture is, right? Ultimately, it's to serve the human person the highest possible way, according to his eternal destiny, or her eternal destiny. And the fourth reflection, this transformation of culture will begin when holiness and culture are brought together. Holiness, right? Not doing it because we like it, we enjoy the work, and it's fun, and we meet all kinds of great people, and we go all around the world. I remember when I came up here, I was how old was I? I was 28 years old. And oh my God, I go all the way from Maryland all the way up to Connecticut. Like, wow, this is like it's a big deal. Well, I think I've been to like 25 countries, right? You join the Legion, you see the world, right? But that can't be the goal, right? The goal is holiness. And what is holiness? Holiness is nothing other really than living out God's will in your life, being the person God made you to be. And then living that day in day, what he's asking of you each and every day, each and every moment, right? And so holiness and culture need to be brought together. We do this because we see this as helping people to discover God's will. So those are like 4 reflections from John Paul, who I think probably the best expert in culture. I'm not an expert in culture, but he's an expert in culture and understands how important that is. And those are like what he would say are things for us to think about, what the core of a culture should be, what a core of a culture needs to be. Now, how do we apply this to our work? So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We talk about the core, we talk about basics. And does anybody know what this is? So the picture there, that's Vince Lombardi. You ever heard of Vince Lombardi? Vince Lombardi was the football coach in the 1960s for the Green Bay Packers. And before he became coach, they'd been terrible for decades. And he became the coach in 1960. And his first meeting with the team, he held the football up. He said, "Gentlemen, this is a football. These are professional football players, okay? And it's got air in it, it's got leather, it's got stitches. Meaning, we need to go back to the basics. We need to remember what's fundamental. We need to remember what is the essence of things. What is the most important things we can't forget. So they went out and they went to the championship game that year, and they lost the championship game to the Philadelphia, was it Eagles or Eagles? The Eagles, oh, the Eagles, okay. And then they came back the next year for a first practice of training camp. And the guys are like, hey, we made a lot of progress last year. There's a lot we can build on. What are we going to do this? We're going to start changing things and how we do stuff. And Vince Lombardi came in the first practice and said, gentlemen, this is a football, okay? Because it's very easy to forget what really matters. What's the most important thing, right? We have this great strategy session here, which is great, but our planning, all these kinds of things, are they the most important thing for building a culture? Are they the most important thing for getting vocations or for helping people to find out what God wants from them? So, go to the next slide, please. I did some research. I found the minutes from the first organizational executive committee meeting of the apostles. And it's an ancient, you didn't hear about this? This was just discovered over in Magdala. And it was dated, and this is just my transcription of the document they found. It was in Hebrew. I had to get some help. But it was back there. And so, bring the gospel of Christ to the world. Here's their resource. Well, they had 11 bishops. Did 11 priests. No deacons, no trained theologians. How can we get this done, right? No religious orders, no seminarians. Go to the next one, please. A few hundred believers, one country, no buildings, no experienced recruiters, and very little money. Influential contacts were few. Public perception was ignorant to hostile. Anybody recognize the situation here? Right? So we think we have it tough. We do have it tough. We got to remember, though, not to let the circumstances, not to let the difficulties, it's such a daunting task, because it is a daunting task today. In today's world, today's culture, there's so many reasons we could just give up. Like, does anybody really care? Does anybody really want to do this? This is a big ask. This is big, And yet, they overcame. Question for reflection, are we in better shape or worse shape than they were in? Well, it's because we can come up with all kinds of reasons. Well, we're actually worse now than we were. Some people are actually saying this is the worst the church has ever had it. Not to diminish, current challenges and problems, but think about that. And I think what is one of the essential things we need to have is a big spirit of faith. I don't think we're going to get anywhere if we don't have faith, if we don't have a real living, deep faith that one way or another, God will be with us, God will help us, God will guide us to where we need to go. And not to get, we need strategies and we need means and everything else is part of the strategy. We need most of all trust in Him and trust that He's still in control. Trust that He really cares about this. Trust that He sees the bigger picture. He sees the importance of a religious. He sees the importance of a consecrated soul. He sees the importance of a priest. And how does our milieu look? I wanted to, if we look at some of the challenges of what we're up against, or what the world's culture is, and how the world's culture impacts us. I don't know if you've ever seen this book. There's a great book here. George Weigel just wrote a book called To Sanctify the World. Has anybody seen it? It's the vital legacy of Vatican II. And what he does is he goes and he puts Vatican II into its context. Like, why was the council needed? And what was it trying to do? And he talked about how basically since the French Revolution, or before that, but really accelerated then, how faith and Christianity no longer were the fallback position of our culture, right? most people, up to then, all the councils were either fights among Catholics about doctrine or fights among Christians when they're Protestants, and that was but everybody believed, and mostly everybody believed in Christ. But now we were what Cardinal Newman called, right? The real crisis was irreligiosity, right? People don't believe. People have outgrown God. They've outgrown God. They don't need God anymore. And so Vatican II the goal was to address that. And if anything, has our culture since then gotten closer back to the ideal or further away? And not independent of what there's been many, we can debate the pros and cons, and many good things have come out of Vatican II. But the world itself has gone probably a little different. And George Weigel, I just wanted to read one little quote here. So the crisis of world civilization that the most insightful Catholic minds of the late 19th and early 20th centuries all believed that the Catholic Church must address, not merely condemn, has intensified since 1962. He's talking about today. That intensification is displayed in a cultural force that has gained considerable political power in the West. He calls it the new Gnosticism. Wherever and whatever Gnosticism has appeared, it has deprecated the material world, the givenness of things. Its 21st century form, the new Gnosticism, is built on the conviction that there are no things as they are, no givens in the human condition, right? So I think we see this all around us, right? Nothing's given, nothing is permanent. There's this, everything about us as individuals, as communities, is plastic and malleable. And that's what we're living in, right? It's for the context of what we have today in the world. So this is the overall big challenge. And another book I wanted to recommend, I don't know if you've seen this one, from Christendom to Apostolic Mission, is by Monsignor James Shea, University of Mary. Well, toward the back, he gives a real good description, I'm going to go over some of the points now, of what the challenges of the current culture are. I would highly recommend. It's a short book. That's why I read it. It didn't take that long. But a lot of really great stuff in it. And one of his main points, though, to start off, he talks about the spirit of faith, is that as Christians and Catholics, it's not that we see some things differently from the world. So we see everything differently from the world. We see everything through the lens of eternity, everything from the lens of God, of God's plan, of the lens of faith, of what God's action. That there's not just what we see, there's an invisible world that's real, that exists. And that really you're not truly seeing reality if you don't understand all that. It's not to say we can't agree with certain, have common ground with certain things in cultures in the world and so forth. That's true. But it's not that because of that there are some things that the secular world that we could benefit from and have common ground with. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that we see a lot more, we see everything differently than they do, even though we might agree on some common points. So we go to the next slide here. Oh, this was, I didn't realize that many women would be here. Sorry. But in front of our daunting task, nothing's impossible with God. We know what John Paul did to communism. This is more of a concrete example here. I don't know if you remember, this is Muhammad Ali knocking out George Foreman. 1974, I was 10 years old. People thought Foreman was going to kill him. Ali was in his early 30s. Foreman had knocked everybody out in like 3 rounds or less, and just brutal, big guy. So then Ali won. He came up, he invented this thing called the rope-a-dope. If you ever heard of that, he would stand there. So his strategy was, I'm just going to let this guy hit me as hard as he can. He hasn't fought that long, and by the 5th or 6th round, he's going to get tired and I'll beat him. And that's what he did. And people thought he was crazy. The trainer was yelling at him, don't do that, he's going to kill you, he's going to kill you. So he didn't tell his trainer. But anyway, so figure I could better explain that, or you think I'm crazy, but that's why that slide was in there. I forgot to say that before we went on to the next point. But it is a daunting task, but we can win. So here's the challenging the secular worldview. These are some points, most of it is from Father Shea's book, that we deal with all the time. And one of the things I have is like this, he calls it faith in progress. It's probably overconfidence in progress. This point that, where you have so many technological, scientific advances in the world today, we think that the moral and the spiritual is also advancing. And it doesn't automatically follow, obviously. Like we're progressing, and we're coming up with new ways of looking at life that are more perfect than the past, and so we want to, interpret history through that. Now, you see sometimes younger people today, some of them sort of have this sense of moral superiority, and we have a generation, I think, you've seen a lot of this out there in the culture, right? That they just know better. You bunch of old people, you fought wars, you did this, you whatever, when you name the whole list of things, without really looking to the context, etc. But this whole idea that just time and progress in and of itself makes people better. So why do we need God? Why do we need the church? Why will we need sacraments? And that's closely tied to the second one, denial of the fall. Denial of the fall, right? It's a lack of education. If we just educated people, they wouldn't do so many bad things. And everybody's good. We overdose on, self-esteem and special, right? If everybody's special, nobody's special, right? And we sort of, you need a balance in that, right? You need to understand, hey, we're fundamentally good. You're truly fundamentally good, and you have dignity and everything else, but you're also subject to original sin. And we see it all the time, right? We see it. Who has the better explanation of reality as we know it, right? And original sin is such an important part of that. But that's one of the things that nobody ever does anything wrong. It was just an external factor. We're all victims. You name it. There's a whole list of things. But that's denying the fall. That yes, there's external factors influence, but we also have free choice, and our own sinfulness, our own weakness causes us to do bad things sometimes. Marginalization of God, right? We've kind of outgrown God. God's good in a crisis, but after that, everything was interesting. You may have seen the football game last year where the player collapsed or got hit and fell down. And I saw the speech by Tony Dungy, who's a former coach, who was he's one of the Sunday Night Football announcers, was talking about this. He said 1996 he was a coach, and after the game one time, some of the Christian players got together and they prayed at midfield. You see that happening now, but he got a fine. 3 days later, I got a letter from the NFL. You shouldn't do that. It's in public, and you can't do it, and he got fined. Well, then they started to allow that. But what he said was striking was when that player went down and it looked like he might have died, we need to be praying. All of a sudden, sort of said, well, maybe God's out there. Maybe we need God, And it was he thought that was an interesting thing to look at. It was people who generally aren't, trying to marginalize God or exclude God, didn't know what to do. Intoxication with the world of time and space, and that really is talking more about invisible realities. We get so fixated on the here, the now, the material, what are we doing, our plans for the weekend, everything else. Do we make time for God? Do we make time for silence? Do we make time for a retreat? Or are we too busy, right? And that becomes just something that's it's such a part of our culture today, right? Time and space, like there's no time to get away, even though people want it. There was talking too much about football, so I shouldn't even touch it. But Aaron Rodgers he didn't know if he was going to play this year, the quarterback, and he famous. Anyway, he went on this 4-day or 5-day. Wasn't a retreat, but just total. He lived in a cave to think about what he was going to do, and it was funny to hear the reactions to that. Like, what a waste of time! What's he? Is he crazy? But there's something, what's behind that, right? There's some desire, hey, I need some time, I need some space. You know, there's more to life than just what you see. And I need time to reflect and think. And the world of time and space just is one of these factors, like, and the phones now, and all the social media distractions make it so hard. And this is one of the challenges we have to think about. 5, freedom to choose is essence and dignity and source of happiness, right? That's evident, right? As long as you can choose your truth. You understand now, well, that's your truth and this is my truth. And well, you know, I don't have a truth. I try to live the truth. I don't create truth. It's not my truth. It's not my truth to own, but there's this whole idea, right? We're so free that we're the essence, you know, and if you would say that you really don't, your freedom has that limitation, that there's an objective truth outside of you that you have to live by, that impacts you, well, that's an affront to my dignity. This absolute liberty that people claim. And their source, you know, also the source of happiness is just, it isn't so much what you do, it's that you did it freely. And the question is, how's that working out in our culture? I don't know. Consumer contentment as a default experience, where, you know, did I really get anything out of it? You know, I don't see the value in doing this. You know, so many things. That's just consumer mindset, right? The church is here to entertain me. The church is here to nourish me. The church is here to, you know, whatever, satisfy my needs. And, you know, the user experience or whatever they call it. So that idea, which can have its impact, you know, on spiritual things. No, spiritual things, sometimes they take time to finally realize, hey, this was a good thing. This was a good thing. So many things, we need to be patient. Now this last one, promise me you're not going to boil me in oil. But I think there's a real issue, and this I put this in here because think about the priesthood. You know, the idea of an all-male priesthood, right? This anachronistic, in today's world, incomprehensible. How can it be just men? And why is that? Because that, you know, it's the way many people look at it, and it's probably, you know, it's. I'm not the Holy Spirit. I'm not in a position. It's not going to change. Okay, it's just not going to change. So it is a challenge, though, in today's world, especially for priestly vocations. Because I think we see there's 3 different kinds of models for men in today's world. You've got the toxic macho man, right? Which, you know, who uses his masculine identity, his masculine gifts to get what he wants, to exploit people, to abuse people, to satisfy himself. And that's a problem. It's been a problem. And I think there's been a lot of, hopefully, corrective action. But some of that corrective action leads to the other side, which is a wimpo man, right? Wimpo man who doesn't use his masculine gifts or his masculine identity. And think about it. What was original sin? Eve gets the shaft on this. You know, Adam was right there the whole time. It didn't do a thing. If you go back to Genesis, right, the sin came into the world, the devil's there tempting his wife, and he doesn't say, you get away from her. He doesn't do anything. And he's just there, well, it's probably not a good time to talk about this, let's wait, you know. Or maybe, you know, yeah, well, it is her choice. You know, and men have learned that, and this is part of our society right now, right? And you see it everywhere, you know, the safe space, the microaggressions, all this stuff, email, you know, stay safe. A lot of guys don't like being told to stay safe, okay? Evangelization is not a safe space, okay? If we look at St. Paul. Now, St. Paul, think about it. What was his self-care plan? So reading the letters of St. Paul, like We talk about we want to form apostles. Yeah, we want to form apostles. Well, look at who was the number one apostle? Well, St. Paul is our first example, right? St. Paul, he did not stay in safe places. He was not very. People should be critiquing him. We should be getting this modern theology. How awful what a terrible example. He abused him. He went to jail. He went to shipwrecks. 2 Corinthians 11. Just read through it. The St. Paul, and then you look at Peter. Peter, Jesus says, come over here, come to me. He didn't have a life jacket on. Peter was walking, he could have drowned. And God was so reckless, he didn't make him wear a life jacket. Jesus Christ sitting there, put your life jacket on. Let me think about it. Or, they're on the ship. Jesus is asleep on the ship. Now, how could God go asleep? All these people were in danger. And anyway, I'm exaggerating here, and this is why I'll get boiled in oil. But one of my undergraduate alma mater, Johns Hopkins, there's a lot of things. It's a very secular place, a very critical, very, very scary place these days. But one thing they did, I think is really interesting. They are now, for their students, creating things called brave spaces. And a brave space is where they're encouraging people, this is where you can, speak your mind, what you really think, and we want to get your ideas on this, rather than the safe space where you just don't want to offend anyone. But anyway, there is this culture, and does that impact vocations? People wanting to make a decision, wanting to say, there's risk in this. Yeah, if I go, what happens if I'm, in the seminary or in religious life for 3 or 4 years and it doesn't work out and it's not really my call? Does that impact some of the culture? And what can we do how do we help people get over some of those obstacles? Many of you deal more directly with the seminarians and vocation. People are considering it, but what are some of those ways that we can counteract that kind of stuff? So the challenge, right? I told you there were 3 ways of looking at men. I'm so sorry. The third way is the example of Jesus Christ. A man who used his masculine gifts, his masculine strength to serve others, not to abuse others and not to not use them. I think we should do a Christ-centered approach in everything we do. We'd look to Christ for the answer. How did he do it? How did he use his strength? Right? He didn't require life jackets. But at the same time, he didn't abuse people. He had this tremendous balance of love and demands and everything else. And I think that should be the model for any man today. Any Christian, anyone, right? Christ as the example, as the center, as the one we should look to for how to be a true man. Whether you're a father, whether you're a priest, whatever your role is, he's our example. And so I would just say that as a building a culture of that Christ-centeredness that we need to move forward. So then, next slide. But also, on a positive note, right? Building esteem, you could say, for vocations in general. And I said priesthood, but just supernatural spirit we talked about, right? How important that is to see who these people really are, who've consecrated their lives, who've dedicated their lives to the Lord, and appreciating that. And talking about that is what a good thing it is. And there's even some benefits from it. I was out at the Napa Institute conference, and I was sitting next to these 2 women. One was the secretary, was the assistant for Father Robert Spitzer. You ever heard of Father Robert Spitzer? And she was telling me about her marriage, and her husband died a few years ago, and she said, it was really something about the ups and downs of that. And I told her, I said, well, I've been running into a few families lately, just some of the problems people have with their kids. Like, you kind of know this in theory, but when you live this with people and how hard it is and almost traumatizing the parents and stuff that they have to do, I said, you know, I've thought to him every now and then, maybe I dodged a bullet. And she goes, that's what Father Spitzer says. He starts laughing. She says, he's always saying that. Hey, you know, I dodged a bullet, right? Not that there aren't crosses, but there's just something about the vocation that allows us, maybe we dodge bullets, but then we're thrown into the middle of so many other bullets, but it's beautiful. It's a good thing. It's a positive thing. You're really esteeming that. And obviously prayer, I know we have the prayer action circles and things, and we'll get nowhere without holiness in prayer. Say understanding the sacrament better, understanding really what it means to be a consecrated person as well, what that means before God. And as far as priests go, in persona Christi, this kind of goes to the next 2 points. You could throw them all together. There's clericalism, anti-clericalism. It's very understandable with the scandals and with sometimes, you know, financial malfeasance, all the different things you hear about going on with priests and bishops. That, okay, in our, sometimes I think, are we, and this is a question, this isn't, I don't know if I have the answer, to address those things. Well, clericalism is so bad, but are we fostering almost an anti-clericalism? So are we in some ways reducing the vocation, are we reducing a priest to mere functions, you know, or do we actually see the person of Christ? And of course, the first person who needs to think about this are the priests themselves. Are you representing Christ in persona Christi? But in that whole context, do we really see how that is and how impactful the sacrament is, no matter how bad the homily was, no matter how bad the talk, you might not like this, whatever, this talk's a terrible talk, okay. But there's more to it, right? There's in persona Christi, and then auto Christus, right? The priest is understanding the priest is another Christ, more than a dispenser of sacraments, more than whatever administrative position or whatever. It's really, it's something above and beyond that, right? It's in a way represent incarnational, right? That the Lord, that's what this is, a sacramental way of looking at life. Should be part of our supernatural way of looking at things. And I do think you could apply this as well to, you look at Vita Consecrata of John Paul II, talking about the witness that consecrated religious life gives as well, as a sign to the world of something beyond the here and now, something that brings our Lord more present to the world. So those are my reflections, Father Martin. I know we had 3 questions. I don't know, you wanted to talk about, we're going to talk about, do we understand what the essence of a culture is? How do we apply that to vocations?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we just field any first reflection, any questions at all for anything that Father Charles might have mentioned. I have a few comments myself, but maybe, Father, what I was thinking we could do, especially in your line of work, because I think we do have a unique opportunity with someone who's been in the field of psychology for many, many years, in the healing ministry. What I found very interesting, Father, is that you said culture is a medium for dialogue and conversation, right? And then listening to others. Could you just speak to, because you are constantly at work with your doctoral programs and all these people coming into university who are preparing themselves to be healers in the culture, and then obviously the teachers, what you're seeing, the power of listening, and speak to a little bit of that, because I think that's, for a culture that's so divided right now, that's kind of one of the key points.
So I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question. So this is what I know. It's not what I do, okay? I'm not a great listener, I don't think. But when you think about it, our initial reaction is usually emotional, right? When they say, in some Aquinas talks about man's a rational animal and something. But think about it, like in your day-to-day, right? We come to the meeting, or you say, hello, how you doing, Father Martin? And if it's warm, you're going to have a good reaction. Oh, good. Yeah. It's like, oh, how you doing, Father? You know, why is he looking at me like that, right? We always have an emotional reaction first, and I think that's something that we need to think about, because Many times, obstacles that people have, it's related to some kind of emotional issue, emotional block. People say, even just evangelize, teaching the faith. We just need to teach the truth, put the catechism out there and people will believe it. Well, we have to do that, but that's like starting point. But how do we get people to the point where they actually want to listen? And I think if it starts, they want to feel heard and understood, right? That make people feel heard and understood. Doesn't mean you agree with them. You might strongly disagree with, but do you accept them and do you listen to them and like what, tell me a little bit about your story, where you're from, and what makes you say that. There's different ways of doing it. It's getting to know people, and that's some of the psychological applications. You see this very often with a lot of the issues now with sexuality. Sitting there and just hearing this person's story is like 90% of it. And a lot of times there are some really horrible things that have happened to them over their lives. And we can say, well, no, you come in, you shouldn't change your gender, right? But it would tell me like what's going on in your life. And you hear about abuse, you hear about, rejection, you hear about all kinds of things that have been building up over and over and over. And trauma is like that. I was talking to a former police officer who's now a counselor. This guy's fascinating. He used to be a contract murder investigator. So he would go out and actually try to contract a murder and then arrest a person who went, because, I don't want to, a couple wants to get divorced and I don't want to pay her off. I'll hire somebody to kill her. This actually happens, right? And so, but he was saying he saw a lot of police officers. What happens is they see all this horrible stuff day in and day out. And they see all kinds of, you have like a tank, and your tank fills up. And then he says, what happens sometimes is the slightest little thing happens, and it pushes them over the top. And you hear, like, it was a fatal accident the other day. I've seen many things worse, but this just made me go, lose it. Now, what happened? Well, it's because, you'd seen all this stuff over and over and over again, and you just never really talked to anybody about it. You were never able to get that off your chest, So, but listening to people, making them feel heard and understood, not necessarily, it doesn't mean you necessarily agree with everything they're doing or how they're living their lifestyle, but I think that's a first step, right? What's on the hearts of people? Okay.
I wonder if you could just comment or explain a little bit how Divine Mercy is attempting to, through the professors, through the faculty staff, trying to form a new type of therapist. Someone who's taking the CCMMP model. Maybe you could explain that a little bit. Like, what is that? What does that do, and how is it changing the culture to build the culture that can help
Okay,
with
so you're going to
these
think
things?
this was a planned question. I want to do a commercial here for the school. It's not. But so what we do is we base our training on the Catholic understanding of the person. And we didn't invent it. It was invented, we got 2,000 years of reflection in the church on human nature. Okay, and we try to make a compilation of that and use that so people really understand, first of all, what is a person? Hold this up. What is this? Right? People get confused today. What is a person? What makes someone happy? And what, all the different aspects of whether we're, well, there's three theological principles. We're fallen, or we're created, fallen, and redeemed, right? So we're created by God. We didn't create ourselves. We're fallen, we're sinful, and we're redeemed, right? That gives us hope. We can overcome our sin. We can overcome our faults. Then you have all your standard philosophical, we're rational, we're free, we're bodily, we're a unity, we're fulfilled in vocation, and we're fulfilled in virtue. So that's the basis of it. And once they understand that, then through that lens, that's how you see all people, and that's how you can evaluate and critique and see what's good or what's bad in a particular therapy. So that's kind of what we do. And I could see that, in vocation work, I think that's important too, right? So understanding the whole person and, is this a calling? Is this person going to be fulfilled? Does he have the level of virtue or she to live this life? And that's kind of what we do.